Queensland has just announced its biggest ever infrastructure pipeline, but can the state actually deliver it? Plans have been unveiled to transform one of Brisbane's last major industrial riverfront sites into what some are already calling the new South Bank, and one of Brisbane's most iconic shopping centres might finally be about to make a comeback. I'll also take you through the journey I went through trying to separate political talking points from the underlying facts behind Queensland's permanent 50-cent fares. Videos like this would not be possible without local sponsors like Excel Psychology and YB Painting. I'm Adam, and this is the Brisbane Channel, your independent source of information on all things Greater Brisbane. Let's get updated. Before we get to the big stories, I'll let you know that these videos are now available in podcast form to channel members at insider and elite contributor levels. Another way to keep updated on all things Greater Brisbane. The Queensland Government has now handed down its second budget since coming into office, laying out where it plans to spend money over the next 4 years and beyond. We'll get to the big infrastructure announcements shortly, but let's start with what many people are likely to notice first: the measures aimed at easing cost of living pressures. As promised during the election, 50-cent public transport fares will be written into legislation, making them much harder for a future government to remove. We'll come back to that later because I spent quite a bit of time trying to untangle some of the claims surrounding those changes. Parents will also receive a larger back-to-school boost this year, increasing from $100 to $150 for primary school students, while the existing $200 play-on sports vouchers will continue. The government has also announced a 2-year freeze on the bulk water price for southeast Queensland, estimating that will save the average household around $130 over that period. That sounds like good news, but there's an important detail worth understanding. Just hours after the budget was handed down, Urban Utilities announced increases to its own water and sewerage charges from the 1st of July. So while the state government's bulk water charge has been frozen, many households across Brisbane and Ipswich are still expected to see the overall water bills increase. It's a good example of how government announcements don't always translate directly into what ends up appearing on your bill. The government is also forecasting electricity bills to fall by between 7 and 10% over the coming year, largely due to lower wholesale electricity prices. Regional Queensland customers supplied by Ergon Energy will receive those savings automatically. However, the Greens have pointed out that in southeast Queensland, where electricity retail is privatised, households still depend on the pricing decisions of their individual retailer, meaning the savings households actually see will still depend on the retailer they're with. Of course, all of these announcements come with a price tag. This budget includes what the government describes as Queensland's biggest ever infrastructure pipeline, with more than $119 billion planned over the next 4 years. That covers everything from new hospitals, schools and housing, through to roads, public transport projects and infrastructure for the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. The government says it's making these investments while also putting Queensland's finances back on a more sustainable footing. This financial year is still expected to finish with an operating deficit of around $8.8 billion, with total government borrowings forecast to continue climbing over the coming years. However, the budget forecasts a return to a small operating surplus of around $619 million by the 2029-2030 financial year. The catch is that the projected surplus doesn't arrive until after the next state election, and it relies on spending growth slowing considerably over the next few years while major infrastructure projects remain on track. Ratings agency S&P Global has already warned that keeping spending under control will be critical, particularly as Queensland continues preparing for the 2032 Games. Keeping our spending under control is important for all of us, not just the government, so if you're planning on updating your home or workspace, you'll be happy for the discount being offered by channel sponsor YB Painting. The multi-award-winning team offer fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on their work, so you know exactly what you're getting up front. You can claim your exclusive 10% discount by scanning the QR code on screen or through the link in the description. One of the biggest questions raised by this budget isn't just how it's being funded. It's whether Queensland actually has the capacity to deliver everything that's now been promised. Several industry groups welcomed the scale of investment, but also warned that announcing projects is only the first step. The Australian Industry Group described the budget as sensible and fiscally disciplined, but said the real test would be whether Queensland has enough skilled workers, contractors, and project capacity to turn those commitments into reality. The Australian Steel Institute made a similar point, welcoming the record infrastructure pipeline while calling for stronger local procurement and better coordination between government, contractors, and suppliers to help keep projects on track. In other words, the challenge isn't just finding the money, it's finding the people and businesses needed to actually build Queensland's future. The budget allocates funding to begin work on the new Brisbane Stadium at Victoria Park, continued planning for athletes' villages across Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast and Rockhampton, and progress updates to venues including the Logan Indoor Sports Centre, the Moreton Bay Indoor Sports Centre and the Redland Whitewater Centre. If those plans do become reality, one place where we'll start seeing the results is on Brisbane's Riverfront. If you've driven along Montague Road in recent years, you'll probably know the old Visy glass factory site. For decades, it's been one of the last remaining industrial stretches between South Bank and West End. Now it's about to undergo one of the biggest transformations Brisbane has seen in years. The Queensland Government has announced that Lendlease has been selected to redevelop the 7.1 hectare site, with plans for more than 4,000 homes, around 1.2 hectares of publicly accessible riverfront parkland, new promenades, boardwalks, plazas, cycling and walking connections, and a mix of shops, dining and community spaces. Construction will happen in stages, with the first section of the riverfront expected to be completed before the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Interestingly, this site has already had quite a journey. Back in 2022, the former Labor government purchased the land with plans to use it as the International Broadcast Centre for the Brisbane Olympics. However, following the Crisafulli government's 100-day infrastructure review, those plans were abandoned, with the review concluding the broadcast centre wasn't needed on the site. Instead, the government has opted for what it describes as a city-shaping redevelopment focused on housing, public space, and long-term economic activity. It's already been described by some as a new South Bank, and while time will tell whether it earns that title, there's no doubt it will become one of Brisbane's most significant urban renewal projects over the next decade. And it's not the only part of Brisbane that's about to be transformed. One place that will probably bring back memories for a lot of long-term Brisbane residents is Uptown, or as many of us still know it, the Myer Centre. For decades, it was one of Brisbane's busiest shopping destinations. It was home to Myer, countless retailers, and for many people growing up in Brisbane, a trip into the city wasn't complete without heading upstairs to Tops, the indoor theme park that became a rite of passage for an entire generation. But over the years, that story changed. Major retailers left, foot traffic declined, vacant shop fronts became increasingly common, and what was once one of Brisbane's flagship shopping centres gradually became a shadow of its former self. Now there are signs that could finally be changing. Vicinity Centres has taken full ownership of Uptown after purchasing the remaining stake in the centre, and says it's prepared to invest up to $350 million to transform it into a premium retail, dining and entertainment destination. The company says Brisbane's rapidly growing population, major infrastructure projects, and the lead up to the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games create what it describes as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reinvent the site. Whether that investment ultimately succeeds long-term remains to be seen. But after years of watching one of Brisbane's best-known shopping centres slowly decline, I suspect a lot of locals will simply be pleased to see someone having a red-hot crack at bringing it back to life. Of course, none of these projects are happening in isolation. They're all part of a much bigger story about how Greater Brisbane is changing. New forecasts released this week suggest Brisbane is on track to overtake Sydney as Australia's most expensive unit market within the next year, with median unit prices expected to climb to somewhere between around $860,000 and almost $900,000. At the same time, the city continues searching for new ways to increase housing supply. One example is in Upper Mount Gravatt, where a purpose-built co-living development has already attracted strong demand. The developer says there's currently a waiting list of around 25 people, with well over 100 inquiries received for future vacancies. Rather than traditional share houses, these developments provide private studio-style rooms with their own bedrooms and kitchen facilities while sharing larger communal spaces. The developer says the project has remained fully occupied since opening and expects this type of housing to become increasingly common as affordability pressures continue. The state government is also hoping to increase supply through its budget, announcing a record $5.7 billion investment in social and community housing, while the city of Moreton Bay has this week received a national award for its innovative approach to partnering with community housing providers by making council-owned land available through long-term leases. Whether it's redeveloping old industrial land, bringing old shopping centres back to life, experimenting with new housing models, or building more social housing, they're all different attempts to solve the same problem. The question has moved from whether Greater Brisbane is changing to whether we can manage that change in a way that keeps the city livable. But creating a livable city takes more than just building homes and infrastructure. It also means making sure there are enough teachers, nurses, police officers, and other essential workers to support a growing population. Education is a good example. The budget includes funding for 22 new schools across Queensland, including several in Greater Brisbane, along with 9 new special schools to help cater for the state's growing population. But the Queensland Teachers Union says the bigger challenge isn't building classrooms, it's finding enough teachers to stand at the front of them. The union welcomed investment in new schools, but argues the budget doesn't do enough to attract and retain teachers, pointing to ongoing concerns around workload, staff shortages, and classroom behaviour. The government, however, says it's already recruited around 1,350 additional teachers and teacher aides, and points to funding for more workplace health and safety coordinators, behaviour support staff, and initiatives designed to reduce administrative workload. Whether those measures are enough will only become clear over time, because in the end, a new school is only as effective as the people working inside it. And that's true well beyond education. Whether you're a teacher, healthcare worker, tradie, or anyone else feeling the pressure of a rapidly changing city, looking after your own well-being is just as important as the infrastructure we're building around us. And if you need support with things like anxiety, depression, managing ADHD, or relationship challenges, you should consider contacting Excel Psychology. They're a warm and inclusive psychology practice based in Spring Hill, just a short walk from Central Station. They've got a diverse team of clinical and registered psychologists, and they focus on matching you with the right person for your needs, often with relatively short wait times. They also offer Medicare rebates with a mental health treatment plan and support for work cover and NDIS participants. If you'd like to find out more, you can scan the QR code on screen or check out the link in the description. And finally, it's time for my 2 cents. Earlier this week, I received a media release from the Queensland government claiming Labor was quietly attempting to remove permanent 50-cent fares from trains, ferries, CityCats and light rail, leaving them only on buses. Now that's a pretty extraordinary claim, especially given Labor introduced 50-cent fares in the first place. If it's true, it's a significant story. If it isn't, that's also a significant story. Either way, I didn't think it was something I should simply take at face value, so I thought I'd fact-check it. At first, I figured it would be pretty straightforward. Read the bill, compare it with the claim, and then I'd have an answer. But it wasn't quite that simple. I started by ringing the Transport Minister's office to ask how they'd reached their conclusion. They pointed me to a particular clause in Labor's bill. I then took that explanation to Labor, who completely rejected it, saying it was blatant lies. Now, that part wasn't particularly surprising. Political parties disagree with each other all the time. What caught my attention was that they were both looking at exactly the same sentence in the legislation and describing it in completely different ways. The disagreement centered on just 11 words. So at that point, I stopped asking politicians and their spokespeople, and I started reading legislation. I read the bill, then the explanatory notes, then the existing Transport Operations Act that defines those terms. What I expected to be a quick fact check turned into several hours of tracing definitions through legislation. And after reading the legislation, I couldn't find anything that seemed to fit with the government's explanation. But rather than assuming I'd caught them out, I thought it was possible I'd missed something. So I picked up the phone again. Not to argue with them, but to ask them to point me at the legislation or contractual arrangements that support their interpretation. The spokesperson wasn't in a position to answer that technical question on the spot, so he asked me to email my questions through so he could seek advice from the department. As I'm recording this, I'm still waiting for that response. And I'm okay with that, because I'd much rather tell you I don't know yet than pretend I've got an answer that I can't properly support. One of the things I've learnt running this channel is that following evidence isn't always neat. Sometimes you find an answer in 5 minutes, but sometimes you spend an entire afternoon reading legislation only to discover you still have another question to ask. But that's how I think these claims should be tested. Not by deciding who to believe first, but by following the evidence as far as it will take you. But for now, that's my 2 cents. And I'm done.